The second is, how do we actually become more proactive? And that is, we have to expand the network of those with whom we engage. And that includes everything from the diaspora to non-state actors, to regional actors, to a whole bevy of people who are not involved in the discussion, in the dialogue now. And that can be done, and that should be seen as a policy prescription. I think also, all too many do not realize how resilient Somalia is, and how many innovations actually are part of Somalia. Two examples. Somali's telecommunications and internet system is extraordinarily strong throughout the continent of Africa. How do you build upon that? How do you build upon the fact that Somalia, south and north, are crisscrossed with small but effective commercial bodies? How do you build upon that, not only within Somalia, but even regionally? Is there a policy prescription here that one should consider? And then, how does one support a more effective communication strategy? Somalis are consensus builders, but also what access do they have to the full panoply of information that would transform perhaps that dialogue? Here is a policy prescription as well. Support more effective communication strategies, both in terms of traditional Somali practices as well as its more modern practices. Why not, for example, put in that communications net, and by why not have the Somalis put within that communications network discussions on religion, the full panoply of religion, and in a transparent way. Another, and the fourth issue that was raised as a policy prescription was what I guess could be called translocalism. If you take a look at the diaspora in Minnesota, in London, in Oslo, etc., how could one actually help and promote an engagement across those bounds, across and between and amongst communities? How can one actually share the resilience of a community in Minneapolis with a community in Bella Twain? So how can one promote that as a policy prescription?
Can we summarize the fifth and sixth together? Is that okay?
Sorry?
Summarize five, six, and seven nice and quickly for us.
What always happens with Somalia? It always gets the last few minutes. Having said that, let me then, since we still are on the fifth minute, also deal with what I think is needed between what you might call greater space, greater platforms for communications within Somali communities in host countries. And that is very important. Governments should not, if you like, promote it, but should support it. It's the communities themselves that should be given, if you like, the space. And then if I can also say that I think one has to take a look at the unanticipated consequences of counterterrorism initiatives, which are needed, but also have to be assessed in terms of counterterrorism. And one thing that I thought I picked up from almost everybody here was the question of how well do we actually understand those communities who we see as a threat? To what extent do we see and understand and appreciate the nuance of the diaspora? And this is something that I think really has to be focused upon more effectively, as I think so did most of the people in the working group. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Randolph. I get to pick on you because you're my colleague, which of course applies to Gary Ackerman as well as an Associate Fellow of ICSR, and also Assistant Director for Research and Communication at the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, the START Center at the University of Maryland. And Gary's group was on homegrown radicalization in the West. And big problem, but you just have a few minutes left, so keep it brief. Thank you.
So there's many facets associated with this issue, and I'll touch on a few of them. I just want to say one introductory word in that we had an exceptionally accomplished and knowledgeable panel today, and we really tried to leverage some of the depth of understanding that came out of that panel, a very diverse panel. So I'll try and present some of the primary findings. They're structured around 4 different questions. But before we even get there, we avoided getting embroiled in definitional quicksand, or we tried to avoid at least, by looking at radicalization in terms of a dynamic process instead of an outcome. We looked at it as a process that involves both changes in beliefs and in behaviors. And we also focused on Islamic radicalization, homegrown radicalization, with the understanding that there are many other types of radicalization that could be looked at and that can inform our current understanding. So the first question we looked at was this age-old one of what exactly are the causes, the underlying factors or the precipitants of homegrown Islamic radicalization in the West. And more specifically, do these differ across different regional, socioeconomic, and other contexts? And it was very quickly established by the panel that this depends on a confluence of factors. Radicalization is not due to any single factor. Generalizations are very difficult, and contingency is predominant. That being said, there are certain common factors that were raised. Although it's by far from the only factor, the jihadist narrative was found to be a foundational factor. This narrative is emotional, fluid, populist, and often inconsistent, but it nonetheless pervades stories of radicalization and different radicalization trajectories in the West. This narrative can actually change. In the case of Somalis in the United States from Minnesota who went to fight for Al-Shabaab, it began as a very nationalistic focused narrative and then changed to a lot more religiously focused narrative. So the narrative is not necessarily static. Another element, common element to homegrown radicalization is some form of alienation with respect to the individuals involved. This is not necessarily the result of deprivation. It can be the result of deprivation. It can be the result of many other factors, but alienation was seen to be a core element. It was also pointed out that in the cases of homegrown radicalization, homegrown may be a bit of a misnomer in that there's almost always an international connection at some point in the radicalization process. And the last common element was found that at least in the current incarnation of homegrown radicalization, there is not that great a depth of religious understanding amongst those who are radicalized. They radicalize very quickly. Often they radicalize in terms of converts. They don't convert first convert to Islam and then to adopt jihadism. They actually convert directly to jihadism. And often there's very little understanding of the depths of what the Islamic religion's all about. It's a very superficial and distorted understanding. So those are sort of some of the initial conclusions about causes. The second question is, as in terms of law enforcement, in terms of other approaches, how can we detect at an early stage homegrown radicalization, and what are the early warning indicators at both the individual level, and are there any at the community level? And if in fact these do exist, can these indicators be effectively monitored while still preserving civil liberties in an open and democratic society, which was an important question. Well, there was a bit of debate about this and not quite consensus, but there was a feeling that there are some effective early warning indicators, especially of the behavioral kind. But these are very difficult to monitor because they generally do not entail criminal behavior, and therefore, at an early stage, it's very difficult in our societies to monitor people who have not engaged in criminal behavior at an early stage. The problem being with this is that without the ability to monitor people who are beginning the radicalization process, there will be a lot of false negatives. In other words, we'll miss many cases, as we have.